Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining Safety Not Surveillance, Resisting Criminalization After Crisis. This event is being organized by the Protect Black Dissent campaign, which is led by MediaJustice in partnership with Free Press and the ACLU. My name is Maisha Hayes. I'm the campaign director at MediaJustice, and I'll be facilitating today's discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to touch on some logistical information about the programming of this event. We're scheduled to last about an hour, and if you need live captioning, please simply click on the live caption button at the bottom of your screen. As you can see, I'm also joined by Dion, who's going to be offering us ASL interpretation. Thank you so much, Dion. While we aren't live streaming today's discussion, I did want to share that we will be recording so that others can view it later. As for our agenda, we'll start off with some background information about the campaign, and then you'll hear some introductions from our amazing speakers. We'll do some scene setting about why we pulled this event together, including some remarks about the petition delivery that we're doing today. Next, we'll hear some special remarks from Representative Rashida Tlaib, and then we'll finally dig into our panel discussion. Please feel free to drop your questions in the chat window, and we'll do our best to respond to them during the Q&A. And finally, if you're familiar with who we are at MediaJustice, we're a national organization based in Oakland, California, that's been fighting to advance the digital and communication rights of communities of color. Some of our work includes leading campaigns, fighting for an open and affordable internet to ensure that our communities have access to a democratic and accessible media environment. But we also work on campaigns fighting against the use of invasive technologies that surveil and criminalize our communities. We're the host of the nation's largest digital rights network, which includes almost 100 organizations on the front lines, fighting for racial, economic, and gender justice in a digital age. Together, we are fighting for a future in which we are all represented, connected, and free. Now, a little bit about the Protect Black Dissent campaign. We launched this campaign in 2017 after an intelligence assessment from the FBI was leaked and exposed a new domestic terrorism category called Black Identity Extremists. This intelligence assessment report claimed that Black activists protesting police violence were motivated by an extremist ideology, which made them a threat to law enforcement and the general public. In 2018, MediaJustice alongside the ACLU filed a Freedom of Information Act request to the FBI to learn more about how they were using this designation. Through a lawsuit, we've compelled the FBI to turn over thousands of documents on this label. And through the course of this litigation, we've learned that the FBI has over 1 million investigative records on supposedly BIE and other similar but also racist domestic terrorism categories. Those of us who are familiar with the history of Black protests won't be surprised by this racist designation at all. The FBI has a long history of surveilling progressive movements for social justice. And beyond the FBI, law enforcement overall has a shameful history of using police powers and surveillance as a weapon to undermine our movements. Today, you'll hear from people representing some of the many movements for justice that have been targeted for surveillance because of their race, immigration status, or religion. And on that note, I'm going to turn it over to our amazing panelists to briefly introduce themselves. After you share your name and your org that you're representing, please tell us in 5 words or less, how do you define safety in your community? I'm gonna start with Ajua, and please remember to unmute.
Thank you very much, Maisha. It's a pleasure to be a part of this illustrious and very activist panel. I represent the Black and Brown Activism Defense Collective. My name is Ajua Ayatoro. In 5 words, I'm a couple words over, but my words are in my community was the question. I view safety as being imbalanced between Black and white, between the haves and the have-nots.
Thank you so much. I'm going to turn it to Ruben next to introduce themselves.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I'm Ruben Talushkin. I'm based here in Detroit, and I'm a national organizer with Jewish Voice for Peace. And I just think safety through solidarity. It's the only way.
Love it. I think that was in 5 words or less. I'll turn it over to Maya next.
Hi there, Maya Berry. I'm the executive director of the Arab American Institute. Safety for my community, in addition to being unhindered personal safety, it means unhindered participation in our democracy, fully.
Thank you so much. And then how about Evan next?
Thanks. I'm Evan Feeney. I'm a campaign director with Color of Change. For me, safety is everyone is fed and housed.
That's right. Sijal, how about you?
Hey everyone, my name is Sijal Nasrallah. I'm the campaign director for Empower Change, based here in Durham, North Carolina. For us, safety at home means when we're organized and well informed, and safety at large looks like political power.
Great. Sandy?
Sorry, hey, it's Sandy Fulton. I'm the Government Relations Director at Free Press. Those are all such great answers. I think in my work, safety means defund and investigate the police.
That's right. And Mike, how about you?
Hi, I'm Mike German. I'm a fellow with the Brennan Center for Justice, and I would say security is equal opportunity and equal justice.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you for joining our conversation again today. So just moving right along, I'd like to take a few minutes to just set the scene for why we've pulled this event. Yes, Evan did go. And we're having some tech issues with Jacinta. So Jacinta, I don't know if you're able to hear us, but okay, cool. So just moving us right along, I want to take a few minutes to set the scene for why we've pulled this event together. As the title suggests, we're here today because too often violent and disturbing events, such as the attack we saw at the Capitol on January 6th, are exploited to expand policing powers and increase surveillance. Despite best intentions, these types of policy solutions more often fail to prevent the next crisis. Furthermore, the threat of violence coming from white supremacist groups isn't a new phenomenon. Just ask some of the members of our national network. One of our members, the Highlander Research Center in Newmarket, Tennessee, had one of its buildings burnt down by white supremacists. Many of our members in Minneapolis saw their city invaded by the Boogaloo Boys and other white nationalists in the immediate aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. In New Mexico, we have members that have been trolled online and targeted by local militia and pro-Trump organizations for challenging disinformation around the 2020 elections. So while the attack on January 6th was upsetting, for our communities, it was not a surprise. In fact, our communities have come to expect that white supremacist violence won't be taken seriously. Recent memory has actually reiterated this for us. In 2017, as fascist white nationalists and militias descended on Charlottesville for the Unite the Right rally, the FBI was busy distributing their intelligence assessment on BIE to almost 18,000 local law enforcement agencies across the country. So when you take a step back and consider this larger pattern of ignoring white supremacist violence while criminalizing movement leaders organizing for freedom and liberation, you'll realize that the attack at the Capitol wasn't just a protest that happened to turn violent. It would be a mistake to blame January 6th solely on bad planning by Capitol Police. January 6th happened because white supremacists are not seen as a threat. They're not seen as violent or criminals. And that's in stark contrast to how Black activists were treated by law enforcement during the uprisings last summer. The bottom line here is that there is a double standard here with how protests by white people is treated differently than protests led by Black people and people of color. That's why last summer, in the midst of the uprisings, we launched a letter and a petition to Congress urging representatives to do everything in their power to cease federal funding for surveillance technologies that are used to militarize our communities and criminalize dissent. Thanks to our partners at Free Press, Demand Progress, Daily Kos, we were able to send over 100,000 signatures to relevant House committees today that have oversight powers over the FBI and can actually demand an investigation into how the Bureau spends its time and resources surveilling our movements rather than responding to the threat of white supremacy. But what we also need right now are champions to fight for our right to protest and to be safe from surveillance. That's why we're tremendously grateful for the leadership of Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, who immediately urged her colleagues to protect our civil liberties and focus on the threat of white supremacist violence. At this time, we'd like to share a video remarks from Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib.
Hello, everyone. I'm Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib. Thank you so much for having me here today. And a special thank you to Free Press and MediaJustice for organizing today's event and all of those behind the scenes that have made this event possible. It is such an honor and a pleasure to get to speak to you all during this very difficult time. I hope you all are safe and that you're well. For many of us, the January 6th attack was shocking but not surprising. Sadly, many of us have experienced that kind of hatred before and know it's a bigger part of this country than people would like to admit. While we may be a nation that aspires to liberty, justice, and equity for all, we are also a nation that officially or in practice has made white supremacy a central pillar of its governance for the overwhelming majority of its history. Our commitment to oppose this hate is what unites us and brings us together here today. We've already begun to hear calls from both sides of the aisle for new national security and surveillance powers to combat the threat posed by white nationalists. This is something that we cannot allow to happen. The intelligence failure that allowed the Capitol siege to occur was not the result of insufficient national security or surveillance powers. If our government and the previous administration had focused more on the threat of white nationalist terrorism and less on harassing Black Lives Matter, civil rights, and left-wing protesters, they would have seen this coming a mile away and taken action to prevent it. To be clear, the reason that the threat posed by these groups hasn't been already addressed is because of a deeply ingrained unwillingness or hesitation to act against these groups within all three branches of government, and especially in law enforcement community, including the Department of Justice, FBI, Department of Homeland Security, and other intelligence agencies. Just this week, it was revealed that the leader of the BAS, a violent neo-Nazi organization that plotted mass shootings and other attacks, had previously worked as an FBI analyst. And he was also a military contractor for the Department of Defense, working directly with US Special Forces in the field, and was an employee of the Department of Homeland Security. At bare minimum, this reveals three things. One, clearly the FBI, DHS, and DOD have not been properly vetting their own employees. Two, this individual's extended employment would not have been possible without a culture of silence and acceptance among coworkers that failed to raise the alarm to a violent Nazi in their own workplace. And three, there are more white supremacists working in government and law enforcement than we realize. The white nationalists who attacked the Capitol and their forebears have benefited from the increased state surveillance power at nearly every turn in our history. The House Un-American Activities Committee, the COINTELPRO, the Patriot Act, the FBI's Operations Iron Fist, the list goes on and on. While not necessarily intentional, increasing the reach and power of our national security apparatus before addressing systematic racism within the agencies would only serve to further oppress Black, Brown, Indigenous, people of color, and leftist groups. Furthermore, to expand our government's national security powers once again at the expense of the human and civil rights of the American people would only serve to further undermine our fragile democracy, not protect it. Until we get serious about changing the culture of these agencies, they cannot be trusted with expanded national security or surveillance powers, no matter how well intended. This is why I led 9 of my colleagues in writing to leadership to pledge our opposition to any new national security or surveillance powers. While only a first step, we must make it clear that we will not accept the continued erosion of our civil and human rights in the name of national security, especially when our government already has more than enough tools to get the job done. Again, I want to thank you for being advocates on the ground and pushing back against these kinds of injustices. And it's always an honor to speak with all of you. The road to peace and equity is not an easy one. And I want to thank all of you again for the good fight for the human rights of all people. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. All right, so let's get started into the conversation. So one important element that was lost in some of the immediate coverage of the attack was the underlying motivations that led people to storm the Capitol. There is a significant portion of this country that believes Joe Biden is an illegitimate president and that the election was stolen, specifically because Black and Brown communities turned out to vote against Trump. As I mentioned earlier, this isn't the first time that Black and Brown people have seen this sort of backlash for exercising our rights, whether that be voting, marching in a protest, or launching campaigns to release our loved ones from prison or jail. I'd like to spend a few minutes asking our panelists to describe the backlash that you've experienced and the sort of steps that you've had to take to protect both your safety, your organizing work, given the threat of criminalization and violence. So I'm going to start with Ruben from Jewish Voices for Peace.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Ruben. I'm with Jewish Voice for Peace, but I'm also a Black person living in Detroit who was here the whole summer during the uprisings. And I was out in the streets just like everybody else. I was brutalized by the police, got billy clubbed like so many people. And one of the organizations that kind of like coalesced during that the uprising and has led a lot of the protests, Detroit Will Breathe, later filed a suit against the Detroit Police Department for those, the excessive tear gassing and the beatings and the surveillance. And what the DPD decided to do in return was to use $200,000 of taxpayer money to countersue the protesters. So that's kind of the state of how Black dissent is being treated by local government here in Detroit. And I think, when you spoke a little bit about specifically the elections and how people are viewing the elections as illegitimate, a lot of this I place at the feet of Chief Craig, who is a Black chief of police, and is a media darling, loves going on Fox News, and the way that he's treated these very two different groups. Throughout the summer, he would consistently push this narrative that the people in the streets weren't really Detroiters, that they were, outside agitators, that this wasn't really Black Detroit, like a lot of the people getting arrested were white, that this was an inauthentic movement, and that it didn't really represent Detroit. So fast forward a couple months later to November, and you have people counting the votes of Black Detroit in in our main convention center downtown, and you have these stop the steal, like armed to the teeth militia protesters, like the type, coming in from every part of Michigan to try and intimidate our ballot counters and to try and disrupt the democratic process and to try and intervene in what would be a majority Black city turning Michigan blue and giving Biden the presidency. So I did not see the kind of police response mounted in response to that, of all of these people coming from everywhere but Detroit to like disrupt our democratic process. The police were very calm, stood back, stood by, and there's just a clear double standard in terms of how the police deals with these right-wing, white supremacist militia types trying to undermine democracy, and a multiracial Black-led coalition of people who are just advocating against police brutality. It's night and day. I have more to say about the, like Representative Tlaib said, it's to call it infiltration, I think, is a misunderstanding, and to say that we couldn't see it coming is just, it wasn't a mistake, it was a choice, because back when the pandemic first started, and it was being called for people to wear masks, we had protesters, militia types, go to Lansing, to the Capitol, bringing their guns into the Capitol, following Trump's tweet to liberate Michigan, right? So there was already a local Capitol takeover. And then a couple months later, it's revealed that there was a serious plot by many of these same types to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer, the governor. So there was, many, many signs of what was coming just here in Michigan that you could have seen it coming a mile away. But if you don't want to see it, then that's a different choice.
Right, that's right. Shija, how about you? Did you see this coming, given the the nature of your organizing on the ground? Can you talk a little bit about some of the steps that you've had to take to protect your organizing and your safety in this sort of environment?
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate that narrative that you shaped for us, Ruben. Yeah, I just wanted to start and say that Muslim communities, like so many populations in this country, oftentimes are targeted first and foremost for living their best lives, right? In Muslim communities, that includes running businesses, sharing spiritual spaces, flying on airplanes, sending money back home to countries of origin to support their families and their people and just make sure they have everything they need, So at a baseline, I just want to name that, like, even outside of this punitive criminal justice system and the FBI, like, there's already this scrutiny in our communities. There's already this level of bias that just shapes who we are and what we can become. And now, like, when I talk about the work that we do at Empower Change, which we're an organization that's just committed to bringing more Muslim folks into the political process in this country, doing the beautiful risk taking that it takes to stand up for something that we believe in or speak out publicly on an issue, there's really a lot that we have to attend to. It's become a best practice in our work to safeguard people, both like individuals, both digitally and physically, based on the ways in which they could be targeted, not just by the criminal justice system, but also by individual actors, right? So, like, if someone is for their first time, attending a protest or speaking publicly about an issue they care about, like, we check in with that person. We say, what is your status? Like, what is your country of origin? Like, what is your nationality? And we make assessments about how that is going to negatively impact them if they do something that's just as benign as, like, taking the mic at a rally and saying, I am feeling this pain. And when it comes to the deeper part of the political process, we hold and have to observe for Muslim communities the ways, not only the status, but like there are also ways that intimidation and harassment is exercised not only by individuals but also by state actors. It is very common and has been very common for decades, and we do lots of know your rights trainings for folks who have the FBI come and knock on their door, right? And they're like, can we come in and have a cup of tea? You want to talk? Like, we just want to get to know you and see how the community goes, and we have to inform people that, like, being organized and being in connection, having a legal contact actually safeguards them, and not being in communication with actors who are coming into their space, coming into their homes, coming into their lives, feigning benevolence, but actually are part of unaccountable systems of racialized violence, and we have to hold that. And so, in a short, that's just what we do. It's almost ingrained in everything that we do in being a social justice organization. And I know many folks on this call are like, yeah, that's exactly what happens, right? But for those of you who are listening, I think it's really important that this is the best practice for us to stay safe.
That's right. One of the reasons why I wanted to start off with this question was because in the immediate aftermath of the attack, one thing that I heard a lot was, Black and brown people could have never successfully stormed the Capitol like that. And I think the stories that, y'all just shared really underscores that sentiment, and that it's much more than just a sentiment. It's not just, anecdotal. Several representatives, such as Congresswoman Eshoo and Congressman Rush, issued public letters asking for an investigation into the surveillance of protesters. But we still don't really know a lot about Black identity extremism, racially motivated violent extremism, iron fist, which thanks to those leaks that we talked about earlier had existed way back in 2015 in the aftermath of Mike Brown's death. So I wanted to ask Ajua first, why is it so important that we address the surveillance of Black activists in previous administrations?
Well, we have to look at it historically. I think one of the things that happens, particularly with, and not just people, conservatives, I think sometimes with those of us left of center, we only focus on what's happening now. And we don't connect it to history. We don't see that from the founding of this country, white supremacy was the basis of the founding of this country. So Black and brown people have always been the targets. They were the others, and we continue to be other, even though we've had civil rights laws and all of that passed, and now we are a whatever, supposed to be a united country, but we see we're not. So it's important to know that history, number one, to stop trying to make what happened on January 6th more special than it is. Of course, it was awful, but the difference in treatment of white nationalists and Black and brown people is historic. White people can walk and do all kinds of things that get ignored historically, and we have books written on it. The second thing I think is important is it's current. In 2017, we had the case of Daniels, and the issue is the injury. So 2017, yes, it was when the Trump administration, but we know from COINTELPRO, even before COINTELPRO, the targeting of Black and brown people, the jailing of them for no reason at all, the fact that much like Daniels, they lost jobs, they lost housing, all of the injury caused. It's not just, oh, well, it was not long-term injury. There are long-term injuries that many Black and brown people have suffered through the surveillance of activism. And then the last point I want to make, in addition to that link, is that when I gave my definition of safety, I was talking about how we felt in our community today. If we really want to create safety in our community, we must have resources redirected to our communities to build strong, healthy structures so that the people in our communities can thrive. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajua. How about you, Evan? Why is it important for us to address the surveillance of Black activists from previous administrations?
Thanks, Mayasia. This is Evan with Color of Change. So back in 2018, also through a FOIA lawsuit, Color of Change uncovered a Homeland Security intelligence document referred to inside Homeland Security as the race paper. What little we know of documents like this and BIE reveals that the FBI and Homeland Security's institutional focus on racial identity as it relates to domestic terrorism, and that parts of the Homeland Security apparatus are improperly suggesting that constitutionally protected Black political speech should be considered an indicator of criminal conduct or a national security threat. And this matters because we still don't know which decision makers approved of these documents or what analysts participated in the creation of them. We don't know how pervasive this line of thinking and analysis within Homeland Security and the broader federal intelligence and policing community is. The same goes for Black identity extremism and Operation Iron Fist. We don't know the details of them, but we do know that the infrastructure that created all of them is still in place, and we've gotten very little in the way of answers. Homeland Security and the FBI both thoroughly stonewalled the last Congress when pressed for answers. It's up to the current Democratic majority to start holding these agencies accountable and removing the people who developed these documents from the government, not granting them expanded powers. We can't just keep moving forward as if the analysts and cogs in the machine of the FBI and Homeland Security aren't still there finding new ways to criminalize Black protest.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so we've talked so much about how white nationalist, white supremacist groups are a threat. And even in the past, the FBI has acknowledged that white supremacist groups pose the biggest threat to our safety. I'm gonna turn this next question to you, Mike. These rioters were able to organize their attack at the Capitol in plain sight. Why has law enforcement repeatedly failed at responding to white supremacist violence?
Thank you very much, and thanks to MediaJustice and the Free Press and ACLU and Color of Change for putting this together. This has been a long-standing problem where the FBI and the Justice Department, as a matter of policy and practice, deprioritize the investigation and prosecution of white supremacist and far-right militant violence. So a lot of it goes back to, as we've already discussed, the foundation of our country as a white supremacist project. And the purpose of policing for hundreds of years was to enforce white supremacy. And that legacy is something I learned more about when I went undercover as an FBI agent into white supremacist groups than in the public education I received growing up and through college and law school. So part of it is this structural problem in our society that views white supremacy as the status quo. And that infects all of our government institutions, particularly our criminal justice system. So that structural racism is persistent. The FBI remains a predominantly white male organization. And if you poll white males across the country, you'll see they have a particular political inclination. So you imagine that that's the thinking that is in these organizations. And then when you layer on top of that, this concept of national security, the way it's promoted is to protect the power, the interests of the powerful versus the more marginalized communities. So it's not just that they don't feel protecting marginalized communities important, is that they actually view them as suspect. And that, I think, is most pertinent for this discussion. In 2006, the FBI piloted a racial and ethnic mapping program. And the whole foundation of that program was racially profiling every American community under the concept that different racial groups commit different kinds of crime, and that they could focus their investigations of those crimes based on the demographics of each community, which of course is something that you would think is so horrible on its face. Usually the FBI gives code names to their programs to mask the problematic intent of them, but that they called this the racial and ethnic mapping program, I think exposes how blind the FBI is to its own racial prejudice. And that program survived the pilot and was actually implemented in full in 2009 during the Obama administration under Attorney General Eric Holder, which isn't what you would expect, but that's why it's necessary to look at this history and understand how this is persistent no matter who's in charge, and particularly that we have a lot of the Obama era individuals coming back into the Justice Department and the Department of Homeland Security. We have to hold them accountable for these past practices, even though obviously the abuses under the Trump administration were far more explicit and far more damaging. That doesn't mean that we can go back to the Obama era status quo and things are fine.
Thank you. Sandy, did you have anything more you wanted to add there?
Yeah, I think, well, as someone who focuses kind of specifically on Congress, it's super frustrating that so many people on this panel and elsewhere have been trying to sound the alarm about these leaks for years now. And they really have. I mean, Evan's talked about it, Maija. It just has not gotten the attention that it deserves. I mean, COINTELPRO and other programs like this are seen as a stain on our history. And this has just not risen to the level that it needs to. There have certainly been letters that Evan kind of referenced, sent by folks like Benny Thompson and others that were ignored. Congress does have oversight, and they do have leverage as well. An example, during the Patriot Act reauthorization debate, it was revealed that an incredibly problematic FISA warrant was used to monitor Trump campaign staffer Carter Page. After that, the right demanded that an entirely new provision was added to that bill to account for just that. Meanwhile, we are seeing that entire movements on the left are being surveilled. And we're just not seeing that kind of leadership from the top of the Democratic Party. We are seeing it from some, but we're not seeing it, broadly in the Democratic Party. And like Congress does have leverage, and I would encourage folks to use that and to get to the bottom of this, certainly around if we're going to have like a Section 215 Patriot Act like reauthorization debate in the next month or so. But even in something like the Justice and Policing Act, which shockingly didn't account for surveillance at all, as if that is not central and dangerous in policing. So yeah, I would just encourage members and staffers to kind of focus on this conversation as well.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it back to Mike. You testified at the House Judiciary Committee yesterday on the rise of domestic terrorism. And I wanted to ask, what was your takeaway from that conversation? Are we doing enough to address, white supremacy and law enforcement?
We certainly are not doing enough to do that. And I think the problem, there are a number of problems, unfortunately, that we're facing. I mean, one was that the Republicans on the committee were very much pushing a false equivalency of unruly protests as somehow equal to an attempted insurrection to prevent the counting of electoral votes in our democracy that left 5 people dead. So that's a big part of the problem. But I think even among the Democrats, whenever there's any kind of a security threat, the knee-jerk reaction is to empower more security resources, not recognizing that those forces are part of the problem and not the solution. And it's really, like Sandy said, Congress has a lot of tools to hold these agencies accountable, and they have been reluctant to use them over the last 25 years, really since the Church Committee was the last time they aggressively looked at these agencies and held them to account. And there were a lot of reforms that were put in place as a result, but it's long overdue in this post 9/11 environment when we've given these agencies broad new powers and an aggressive attitude about how they should apply them.
I'm gonna pivot a little bit and kind of talk about how we've made it a point to address how in moments of crisis, has been leveraged to in the past to pursue solutions that don't keep us safe. In the aftermath of this crisis, we're seeing members of Congress want to expand domestic terrorism categories and surveillance to fight against, violent extremism. I wanted to turn to Maya to ask about this terminology. Where did this terminology come from? And how does using this terminology still end up criminalizing communities of color?
Well, thank you so much for including us today. And thanks to all of my colleagues and all the work that they've done in pushing back against this highly problematic framework. I think I would start to answer that by explaining that, as has been pointed out by multiple speakers, this increase in white supremacist violence is not new, right? One of the first cases of it we can point to is responding to previously enslaved people, Black people, wanting to vote and seeing the Ku Klux Klan Act and the Civil Rights Act of 1871 passed at that time in response to that violence, right? That's the context in which this conversation needs to happen. So as we think about how we respond to it now, it's important that we understand that for securitized communities, which includes Arab Americans, which includes American Muslims, which includes South Asians, which includes the Black community, these are communities who've had a desperate impact. The policies of our government have created a desperate impact on them. So when we talk about now, and I think for the most part, very well-intended desire to respond to white supremacist violence by saying it, let's call it what we've called it when other people have committed these acts, because technically, terrorism is ideological free, right? It's supposed to be about the violence. Well, that's not historically what's happened here. And as we look at what happened on January 6th in particular, there is a definition of what an act of domestic terror is, and it's found in the Patriot Act. And what happened on January 6th, one would argue, meets that definition. So if a member of Congress or a policymaker or an advocate wants to use that term, we understand that they can do so for descriptive reasons. Our position is, though, cautioning, let's take a moment, let's pause, And before you put political and legal definitions, additional powers to those, we have to be cautious. So our federal government has 57 different laws in place that address terrorism. 51 or 52 of those can apply to acts that meet the domestic terrorism, whether or not you choose to apply material support or not. So there's ample laws that exist to go after this issue. As my colleague Mike German has already sort of pointed out, it's been about policy and practice and not the law. So it's incredibly important that we explain to our colleagues and those who are in this position that we understand. You mentioned BIE, Black Identity Extremism, a completely fabricated category. Before we got to BIE, we had decades, years, including under the Obama administration, of what was called CVE, which is Countering Violent Extremism Program, targeted primarily the American Muslim community. So we know these practices are put in place, they target specific communities, and then they make their way into others. And it's not unreasonable for us to suggest that if government were to be given additional powers, like a new charge of domestic terrorism, that it would be much more likely to be applied to an Arab American organizing on behalf of Palestinian human rights, or to a BLM activist combating the police brutality. It's simply the history of where these charges have come from. So I would point out that that's where the context that we need to be talking about. And then I would add, the last time the FBI reported on domestic terrorism was back in 2005. We have a huge problem in making sure that our government, our Congress, provide the appropriate oversight. We have to have the data that's necessary. And one of the things that I think very troubling things that happened under the Trump administration, there were many, but one of them was to literally change the categories by which they report on this violence. Instead of calling it white supremacist violence, which is what it was originally characterized at, they changed it to racially motivated violence, which is a way of sort of concealing the actual data. There's still ways to get to it, but my point is that it's critical that we examine the different changes that have been put in place. And then the final point I would make is, and I regret that I don't know who tweeted this, but it impacted me deeply when a colleague shared it with me. There was a point that was made. We're not asking you to kill them like you kill us. We're asking you not to kill us, right? So we're not asking for increased surveillance and a violation of our civil rights and civil liberties to be expanded in this country. We're simply saying that those bad practices put in place as part of our counterterrorism efforts and the endless war on terror need to cease. They don't need to be doubled down on, even when it comes into suggesting that it's about getting to a better place and a moral equivalency.
That's right. We do not want equal opportunity surveillance. I know that Ajua had a few points that you wanted to add. Ajua, get to unmute yourself.
Sorry, I muted myself. Ajua Ayatoro, and I am with the Black and Brown Activism Defense Collective. I just wanted to add, several people have made the point of Congress needs to act and they haven't acted. I think one of the issues is, I think we underrate the numbers of people in this country who still believe in white supremacy and have internalized it. And I mean, the gentleman that spoke first, I'm blanking on the name, that talked about the Black police chief in Detroit. We see it, we talked about Obama and the CVE, and we're talking about, so we're talking about whites, Blacks, whatever. This white supremacy is, when I used to teach, I would tell my students, they crack up, but they drank the juice. This has been internalized. This isn't just something that can just be whiffed away. And what we see, at least I have seen with whites who have, and Blacks too, who have really addressed their anti-Blackness or anti-brownness, that takes work. That takes wanting to do it. That takes wanting to look at your own conduct and behavior. I think that Congress and those who are listening to this, who are congressional people and staffers, need to take seriously the need to actually study anti-racism. What does that mean? Because you can then inform yourself how even unintentionally, unconsciously, many people embrace this stereotype. They see a Black person and they see a thief or a murderer, or a brown person, a thief, a murderer, or whatever else. They see a white person and they see someone that may just be going down the wrong path. And so that's part of what happened maybe on January 6th. They're just going, they really aren't violent. They really aren't breaking this glass in the Capitol for any mean-spirited way, or they're like us. And I think we have to grapple with that we can't just look at people in Congress and say, well, if this Black person should have this view. I think that's also racist, to assume that because I'm Black, I should have a certain view, or because I'm brown, I should have a certain view. And so I wanted to ask Maisha if I could make these comments, because the work is harder than just flipping a switch. The Congress has to be sincere and really want to study it, so that they can confront the Republicans, as somebody mentioned, I think Mike mentioned, that want to make it equivalent. But you can't just confront them with boom, boom, boom. You confront them with you knowing the difference, you voting the way you know it should be. And so I just wanted to add that. Thank you so much, Maisha, for letting me do that.
Of course. And Sandy, I know you had a few points that you wanted to share. And then I do have one final question for our panel, and then a closeout question, and then we'll open it up to comments. But Sandy, take it, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. No, I actually just wanted to kind of build back. Yeah, in Congress right now, there's an urgency to do something. Just caution folks to first do no harm. Law enforcement has all the resources they need. They have massive amounts of resources. It's a matter of where they're putting them and where they're prioritizing them. And I would encourage you to take a critical eye to law enforcement. That is not easy in Congress. I know that it's difficult. It is not the culture in Congress to be critical of police. It's not the culture in America, but it's a problem. This was a failure on their part, and Congress needs to examine law enforcement. But yeah, and it's also another big problem in Congress is there's kind of this gatekeepery thing that happens with these issues. Too often these issues are left to the leadership of certain committees and leadership in the party. And we do have champions there for sure. But we need more voices in this fight. I've been so grateful to see folks like Representative Tlaib and Ilhan Omar be so vocal in this fight. They were instrumental in sunsetting the Patriot Act. And that's the first time that's happened since it was passed. So yeah, as Adja was saying, we need to be examining anti-racism. We need to be examining cops. That is difficult, but that is exactly what we need to be doing right now.
That's right. So my final question to the panelists, and that would, I do want to talk a little bit more about what Congress could do, but one important thing I felt like it was really critical to mention is how authorities were able to identify one of the rioters using data from an electronic monitor device. This individual was mandated to wear this as a condition of their release. And since the riot at the Capitol, we've actually seen an uptick in the use of facial recognition technology across the country to reassure the public about our public safety regarding this very problematic term called violent extremists. To be clear, to my knowledge, we don't know if facial recognition was used to identify the rioters, but in response to this crisis, we're seeing the use of this technology being used. I wanted to ask Ruben and Sijal, how have moments of crisis in your work widened the net for the use of surveillance technology, and what have been the consequences of that use? Ruben, would you mind going first?
Sure. Well, I mean, speaking frankly, here in Detroit, Detroit has been a pilot city for the use of facial recognition technology in law enforcement. And the consequences of that have resulted in Black Detroiters being arrested. A man was arrested on his lawn in front of his family because the algorithm misidentified him. you know, and he spent time in jail. He was detained, and it was completely the wrong person. He had nothing to do with whatever they were investigating. But now he has that experience behind him. Now he has that interaction with the system, and we know that sometimes that it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy where like you get profiled and then they pick you up and they say, oh, it wasn't you, but now that incident is in your history, and so they view it as some kind of like prior justification, and it just becomes this layering thing. And viewing that in the context of just this larger political moment that we're in, and you know, the January 6th, the Capitol riot, like I'm driving around Michigan and I see on these giant billboards, like the FBI, like, got any tips on, you know, the Capitol riot? Like, call us up, let us know if you've seen anything. You know, they want to kind of like crowdsource this, you know, surveillance and have us all watching each other. But I remember earlier in the summer, they were able to find people based off of their Etsy purchases, right? You know, like they combed these people's data. They were able to like identify the gait of their walk or like tattoos or whatnot, so they can find people when they want to. But when it comes to, you know, targets that are not really politically preferable to them, they want to kind of outsource that responsibility to the community. So that's what I'm seeing.
Thank you. And Sijal, how about you?
Yeah, thanks, y'all. You know, I'll just start and say that there's in among like Muslim communities, and the way that I've seen this play out is there's a real fear. I think it's been named in tangential ways on this call, but there's a real fear of when the word terrorism is instrumentalized by our political leaders. It's, and I'll share a few examples, but we just believe it's a term that has been used to harm us, and I think that it has been used has been used to profile, has been used to harm us, has been used to wage wars on majority Muslim countries, and has been used to continue to vindicate that kind of violence. And so I just want to name that I won't be using that word to identify the violence that happened at the Capitol, but you know, I want to name just the kind of things that we've seen over the past 2 decades that have come up that have particularly really devastated the lives of so many people, that have come at the tail end of events of violence. And you know, I want to talk about that 2001 was the year that we saw the Patriot Act. 2001 was the year that we saw the authorization of use of military force, which I know is being contested in different ways in Congress these days, and I hope to see it permanently removed. That has continued to wage endless wars and legitimize drone strikes on many Muslim majority countries as well as other countries in East Africa. We see 2002 as the year that DHS and ICE was created, and then we have to navigate that, and we have to deal with the bloated military budgets and Pentagon funding that has just wreaked so much damage on people's lives in this country and then abroad. And then I also, you know, want to talk briefly about the ways that there's a kind of move in policy, but also culturally that has damaged us for so long, and the use and propagation of programs like countering violent extremism, which I think many people have heard about, also preventing violent extremism, which is the California narrative on that program that is now decentralizing and giving funding to educational institutions, to corporations, to research and development institutions, to defense funders, to undergraduate students who are trying to learn about the world, and they're tasked to create programs that help counter violent extremism. And we've seen in that program, and which was an Obama creation, we've seen in that program that is despite the marginal ways that it addresses the prevalence of violence perpetrated by white supremacists, it is broadly targeting Black and brown communities. It is massively targeting Muslim communities. And this is now decentralized. This is cultural work of eroding our communities, labeling our communities, profiling our communities. And now, and I want to say this, and we see this happen over and over again, is now we see the government turning to corporations like Facebook, corporations like Amazon, Microsoft, Google, looking for answers about how can we do this work better, without ever interrogating the amount of harm, without ever coming and reconciling with the ways in this has negatively impacted us. And I'll just close with this last thing, but there was a victory on December 17th of 2020 where the Supreme Court, in a case, Tenzin versus Tanvir, ruled that it was legal. It was finally legal after 2 decades, where individuals who have been intimidated and harassed by the FBI can sue the FBI for the first time. There was a group of Muslim men who they were harassed at their jobs, their passports were revoked, they were placed on no-fly list, and their lives were just completely eroded because they refused to work with the FBI. And this was the first time after 2 decades where they were given the legal ability to try their oppressors in that way. And I just want to name that, like, we have a lot more work to do. I think many of these folks covered a lot of the other topics, but I hope we can move forward.
Thank you so much. So, y'all, unfortunately, we are pretty much at time. So I just want to thank you so much again to our panelists for joining this briefing. All of you made such excellent points, and I'm so glad that we were able to have this conversation today. I want to allow folks to maybe just share what representatives can do next one more time, with like a special announcement from Ajwa about some next steps that we're going to do after this briefing. So I'll start with Sandy, actually.
Yeah, I think I kind of jumped ahead earlier and kind of answered this, but yeah, I would just encourage folks to engage and be critical of law enforcement, which is not a popular concept in Congress. It's really hard. There was kind of a brief moment during the Capitol attack that everyone recognized that the response from the police was not the same as it would have been with Black people. And now we are just not talking about that anymore. They came back to the building and they thanked the police. There is just, and they do that. And police do great work too, but we need to examine the resources that they have and do they need them and what are they doing with them? And it needs to be much more transparent. And before we try to give them any more power, we need to have some accountability.
Mm-hmm. Ruben, how about you?
Sorry, just finding the unmute button. Yeah, I think one of the lessons that we should pull from these last several years of organizing against police brutality is that more resources for the people committing these offenses, it just never has the effect of reform. And I think we need to just always, pick up the phone and let our members of Congress know that that's not what we're asking for. Like, if someone fails at their job, you don't reward them for that. And there was a guy down in Tallahassee who's already being, was arrested for, so-called being on a path to radicalization. So we already see that these resources are being, he was a leftist. We already see that these resources are being used against everybody, but the perpetrators who are in clear sight. And to add to what others have said, I'm just thinking of another example of a Boogaloo boy who died in a conflict. He was a shootout with police in a Detroit suburb a couple months ago, and he turned out to have been part of the Ruby Ridge incident back in the 90s, and and then we also look at Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City bombing as these precedents of like what would be considered domestic terrorism that like created the, you know, fervor of the late 90s to respond and do something. And then we get the Patriot Act, but who was that used against? You know, Maya and Sajal have already spoken to that extensively. So I think we really need to like be loud and vocal to our leaders in Congress that like more powers to the people with the cameras and the guns is not what we're asking for. You know, more money to them, that's not what we're asking for. And certainly don't want our money to be spent on that.
Thank you. Mike?
You know, certainly for Congress, they need to do more oversight. They've passed a law demanding data from the FBI. The FBI was supposed to produce it in June and has not. So there's much more Congress can do. But for the audience, you know, it sometimes seems like it's hard to hold the FBI accountable, but we've worked with local activists in Portland, San Francisco, and Oakland to get their local representatives to pull their local police out of the FBI Joint Terrorism Task Forces. And I think that's a powerful statement to the FBI that our local communities are not accepting their tactics and their methods. And if you're interested in trying to model that effort, contact the Brennan Center, and we'd be happy to put you in touch with local activists who are working on these issues.
Maya, how about you? Do you have any suggestions for next steps?
I do. I think one of the key things that we can do during this discussion is to make sure that we understand that before January 6th, we had Charleston, South Carolina, we had Tree of Life, we had Charlottesville, we had El Paso. Our country has been seeing a surge in hate crime. And it does not need to be deemed terrorism in order for it to be taken seriously. So it's incredibly important that we, in this context of the conversation, push back on the fact that we continue to fail on adequately reporting on hate crime and responding to it. The FBI releases the information in November of each year. For 2019, the last year we have data, they reported just under 8,000. The Department of Justice's own internal numbers put it closer to over 200,000. That discrepancy is unacceptable. So when we want to say, what do? We have something called the Khalid Jabara Heather Heyer No Hate Act. It improves reporting on hate crimes, and our response to those must be improved. Mike mentioned the lack of FBI reporting. We have something called the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act that is focused exclusively on acquiring better data as opposed to creating a new unnecessary and potentially discriminatory charge. So there are things that can be done in this space. And one of them is, again, to not require that we deem it terrorism in order for it to be taken seriously. Violence is violence.
Thank you so much. And then I'm going to go to Sijal, Evan, and then Ajua, and then we'll close.
Nothing incredibly new to add. I would just say that we need regulations on the tech billionaire class and the tech that they're creating to erode our lives. We need to hold these Lex Luthors accountable and make sure they don't continue to feel empowered and emboldened and richer off of government contracts that have no ethical standards based on how to address racial bias, no ethical standards for how to accommodate for human rights. It's too wild out here. And then you know, I think in terms of the way I think about in terms of the way a core aspect of the ways that surveillance is being propagated is through military spending and those budgets. Any and all spending that is going to inflate our military, to inflate the Pentagon, to inflate these tactics and offices in our government that are punitive, that seek to control and interrogate and surveil and bomb. These are not working. These are not keeping us safer. This is not making our country safer, and we need to make that distinction. Repeal the AUMF and these endless wars.
Thank you, Evan. If you have anything more to add, I know we covered a lot. So
yeah, I think just like super quick, like we mentioned a bunch of different like documents, intelligence assessments today, Black identity extremism, Operation Iron Fist, the race paper. We need oversight action from Congress to, fully expose what's in these intelligence assessments that are suggesting race or Black political speech or indicators of violence. And are there more of these documents? Like there's probably more than just the Black identity extremism document. And we need a deep like church committee level investigation into how pervasive is this type of thinking within FBI and Homeland Security's analytical and intelligence structure.
Thank you. That's perfect. And Ajua, do you want to talk a little bit about what next steps we need and what next steps we're working on together?
Sure. I'd like to say first to Congress that I support all of the panelists' requests. I think that we really need to look at the disparities, honestly, straight on. They need to do that. That's part of the church committee replication that Evan talked about. We don't need any more laws on surveillance. History has shown, I don't care how well-meaning, so-called well-meaning they were, I'm not sure they were always well-meaning, but well-meaning it was that Congress developed a law. Somebody mentioned the Patriot Act. It got turned against Black and brown people. So we don't need those laws. We need to have resources redirected to the communities of color and for communities to help them build communities where people can feel safe and be safe and have requirements of equality and fair treatment from law enforcement. With that being said, the Black and Brown Activism Defense Collective and MediaJustice are working on developing a lobby day. Maisha mentioned it early on in the beginning of this forum, a lobby day where we actually lobby Congress on various things. We're developing it now. It's all going to be focusing on ending surveillance and targeting of Black and brown activists. That's the general thing. And we're meeting now. A number of organizations have come together, ACLU, others. I don't want to name them because I don't have the list in front of me and I'm sure I'll forget somebody. But we're coming together, meeting, strategizing on the lobby day, and it will be sometime in April. If anyone in the audience or anyone on the panel, I'm sure, want to be a part of it, they should be in touch with MediaJustice since most of you have contact with them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, y'all. I appreciate all of the brilliant thoughts that y'all laid out today and really clear next steps. Please be sure to follow all of the amazing organizations that were able to, participate today. And with that, I'm going to close this all out. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.